So what other aspects of scalability for teams are important? What are things that people should be thinking about as they try and add new members to their teams? What do you think about when you do that?
Well, I think about getting the best people. That's by far and away the single most important contributor to success in almost anything, but certainly in software. And what's interesting is most people who recruit software developers would agree, yes, I want to get the best people. The good guys are 5 times more productive than the average guys. They agree with that, but they talk the talk, but they don't walk the walk. They're not willing to do what's necessary to get those good people. And in fact,
so
that's a huge yeah. So there's different ideas about it, but the fundamental principle is you've got to expand your net. Cast a wide net. So what we do is we advertise globally. We try not to make any assumptions about where people are going to be located, and we do trials. So on all of our projects, there are people who we bring in on 1 or 2 week contracts, and we try working together. And if we like them, then we try to get them for a long-term contract. Then that's a success. That's a hit. So it's a pretty simple process. The process that we've evolved towards is actually throwing people in on real projects and asking them to do real tasks that are tasks we need done. And the reason that I've taken that approach is because I've noticed, my goal is that these candidates should succeed. And I've noticed that if I give them tasks that are just test tasks, I don't pay enough attention. We don't respond as quickly as we might, and they're less likely to succeed in their trials. So it's really a way of managing our own priorities, perhaps, but it works for us. We try to make this evaluation period a specific period and do good evaluation feedback at the end. They say what worked for them. We say what worked for us. We find that the tools, the Assembler.com tools that we use are important because we're able to drop people in and they can see everything that's going on. They get all the information that they need in one place, and that's going to help them get started more quickly. We don't do interviews. So I'd like to turn this over to you, and you can talk about your interview process. But so there's 2 interesting things that I just said. We don't do tests. We put people into real projects, and we don't do interviews. And the reason we don't do interviews for development-oriented roles is because we believe, first of all, that it's going to take a long time. It takes a long time to schedule interviews. It takes time for people. It actually costs money, almost as much money if you figure it out as doing a trial, to set up an interview. And so we don't want that delay to be factored into our process. But the other thing that's interesting is interviews often lead you to hire the wrong person, because a person who's good at interviewing is not always good at the job that you're interviewing them for. And there's a book called Blink, which is Blink, the Power of First Impressions, which talked about how the personal impression that you get from something can sometimes be right and very useful, and sometimes wrong and misleading. And in the example of misleading category, they talked about how if you're trying to hire someone to play a French horn, if you interview them first, you actually get a different impression of how good they are at playing the horn, and often a mistaken impression.
What's the best way to find out if someone's good? It's in hindsight. It's to have seen them work for a week, a month, a year. At each stage, you get different impressions. I mean, your first impression when you speak to somebody, when you hire them, can be very different from the impression that you get when you see them stand in front of a problem and you see them thinking about that problem. You might suddenly change your whole position on whether they're capable to do the programming task or the task that you're going to give them. Then after the first week, you get more information and more information as you go. And I think that's why there's a lot of interest in retaining people on a long-term basis, because you build up an understanding and a trust at the same time. I think for us, is sometimes it's not possible for us to be able to create actual project tasks for somebody to work against if they're not actually at that particular company. So in that case, the interview process has to be as asymptotically close to that as possible. But you know, it's one of those things where the more elapsed time you can be interacting with somebody, I think the more resolution you get on that. So for us, it's a case of not one interview, but several interviews where you're actually trying to simulate as closely as possible the task that somebody would be doing if they're actually doing the project. And inarguably, the longer you have that process and that interaction, the better the granularity on their capabilities on that given task. So, a week is 40 hours, right? So, that's quite a lot of time. Multiple interviews can also be a significant amount of time, but, you get one level of resolution, a week more, a month more, and so forth. And I think what's interesting is also somebody's fit for one given job might not be, and you might even understand after several months you're working with a programmer who's a lead programmer for a project and they have aspirations or interest to be a project manager. What they think of themselves internally is often different from when they actually work in that role, and they might find that they don't like it. So, I think in that case, even though you're working with someone for a long time, because the scope of tasks that you're working with them on may change over time, I think it's an ongoing process.
It is, but if you fully evaluate people in everything that they do and change your mind about people over the course of a week, you're really a better man than I, and than most people, because studies show that you form an opinion about whether you want to work with someone when you meet them in the first 30 to 60 seconds, which shows how carefully you have to manage that time. And in fact, when people do these distributed team trials, I find that within a very few days. And in fact, the major reason that people fail in trials is they don't show up for work.
Right.
So, that's the most basic qualification.
And that's why we have several interviews, because if someone doesn't show for an interview, it gives you information about their ability to schedule time appropriately and be able to prioritize something which is obviously important, a job. Your job.
Yeah. Yeah, it's important.
So I think we're both in agreement on this, on that actually finding people and profiling people is a very difficult task, and to the extent that you would actually want to work with them for a whole week or longer in order to be able to see whether they're a good fit or not. And I think in terms of finding quality people, however you go about it, it's important to factor that as something that you want to dedicate a lot of time to. Otherwise, you'll find that if you put somebody on a task and you haven't properly profiled them and you're not checking in with them on a regular basis and you hope that you come back in a month and find a completed project, you'll probably have a lot of disappointment.
Exactly. If you're going to work with people, you have to work with them.